Emmanuel moved like a man used to people moving for him. His life had been measured in exact sums, in ledgers, in glass towers that caught the sunlight and threw it back like a promise. He had power, precision, and an island of certainty inside a sea of deals. So when he took a morning walk through the city to clear the residue of boardroom battles from his head, it was supposed to be a ritual. Short, a little sweat, coffee from a tucked-away place he'd discovered because he liked the way the barista shaped crema. But that morning the city rearranged itself around a small, informal market off a busy street. There, under a faded blue tarpaulin, a woman with a way of balancing tomato crates as though they were something fragile and wholly moved between customers. She laughed easily with an old man bargaining for 2 baskets. She arranged her tomatoes with the care of an artist. Each tomato sat like a small sun. Emmanuel paused without meaning to. His board meetings and glossy invitations fell to the periphery. It was a tiny, absurd distraction until she looked up. Her eyes were honest and quick, and when they held his for the span of a heartbeat, something unaccountable happened. The world, the neat timelines, the meetings that would later be arranged to discuss acquisitions fizzled into a soft haze. The woman smiled, a small, disarming smile that reached her eyes and warmed the dusty morning. Emmanuel felt the slow, surprising pull of his chest tightening. He had read people for power, understood motives, seen reputations constructed and dismantled like stage props. But nothing in any dossier or briefing could prepare him for the simple, instant certainty that moved through him then. This woman had his attention. He moved closer under the pretense of buying fruit. He overheard her speak, the cadence of her voice like rain after a long dry spell. Her name Grace fit her the way a well-cut garment fits a person who has grown into it. She greeted everyone with warmth. She refused to haggle people down too far, tucking back coins as though some invisible ledger told her what fairness looked like. When Emmanuel placed a small stack of naira for a crate, she counted and smiled as if the money itself were an honest thing. Grace didn't look at him as someone newsworthy. She looked at him as a person whose presence was simply another fact in her day. That steadiness made the pull stronger. It was as though she anchored him in a world that had long seemed unreal. He left with a crate of tomatoes and a traded number on the back of a receipt he almost forgot he had asked for, and he left with a head full of light and a heart skittish in a way he had not known since youth. On his drive back to the glass towers, the city felt different. Routines that had felt immutable now seemed negotiable. Decisions that had previously been automatic, the color of a tie, the cadence of a lunch meeting drifted in importance. He replayed the way she had smiled, the way her hands had arranged the fruit. He told himself he would not be foolish. He was a man of substance. Love at first sight was a phrase for novels, not balance sheets. Still, he kept the receipt with her name on it in his wallet, next to a photograph of his childhood home, a tiny, private talisman he refused to explain. Back at the company, he went through the motions with a mechanical precision that made his colleagues comfortable. Yet every so often his mind wandered to the market stall, to the soak of sunlight on red skin, to the kind eyes of the woman named Grace. He had not planned to be so moved by any ordinary morning, but the world had a way of rearranging itself for reasons one couldn't always explain. And Emmanuel, who had made a career of engineering outcomes, found himself powerless before a feeling that felt like gravity. That evening he returned to the market under the pretense of buying more tomatoes. Grace greeted him like a familiar face because now, by the crumpled receipt and the large crate he insisted on buying, she recognized him. She moved between customers with that same gentleness, unaware of the torrent she'd stirred inside a man used to controlling everything. Emmanuel watched her and wondered how a life of fortune could have left him so unarmed against such a small thing as a smile. He suspected then, not with calculation, but with a warmth that was pure and startling, that this morning was the start of something that would rewrite the rules he'd held for so long. Emmanuel discovered that loving someone who lived on a different street of life meant learning a language he hadn't studied. He had built companies by reading contracts. With Grace, he learned to listen for pauses, to notice the small, unspoken syllables in how she said a sentence. He asked about her day, about how she kept tomatoes fresh under the heat, about why she preferred certain baskets. Grace answered with stories of mornings when the dew still clung to crates, of an aunt who taught her to pick fruit with a gentle thumb, of a stubborn stall that refused to be beaten by rain. They began to meet, often the billionaire and the tomato seller, and the city watched with the lazy curiosity of an old friend seeing a new pair of shoes. Emmanuel would arrive sometimes with small, thoughtful things. A bottle of water for the noon sun, a paper fan on a particularly blistering afternoon, once a thermos of ginger tea that made Grace laugh. She, in turn, offered him the truest hospitality, handing him a piece of fruit and insisting he try the one she liked best. Those exchanges were simple, sacred. People in the market whispered a little, not out of malice but because the sight warmed their own practical days. But Grace carried an inner hush. It was not emptiness. It was a careful silence, like an untold story folded and kept safe. Emmanuel noticed the way her voice would falter if asked about family, how she guarded her smile when children walked past. He respected boundaries and gently tried to open channels of trust, not because power could buy a person open but because he wanted the truth between them to be voluntary. She told him about her mother, who had died young. She mentioned a friend who had taught her to box her groceries with patience. But when conversations wandered to partners or children, Grace became a lake with a still surface present, reflective, but declining to show its depths. Emmanuel loved that she chose him for small things, not for his name. He loved the way she spoke of mornings as if they were altars to be kept holy. But his mind, schooled to reckon eventualities, wanted full accounts. He had learned to accept that not all truths surface at once, especially if they were wrapped in shame or fear. So he built patience like scaffolding around them, offering tenderness and time. Then, one sunlight-saturated afternoon, a child came trailing after Grace as she closed her stall. His shoes were scuffed, his eyes bright and searching. He clung to her skirt with an easy familiarity, and Grace moved as though she had always known his rhythm. The child laughed, and the sound loosened something in Emmanuel that had been tightly wound by absence and boardrooms. He watched them together and felt a tenderness that moved through him like light through glass. When he finally asked, not in the hushed way of a man extracting secrets, but in the candid manner of someone willing to accept complexity, Grace's face folded like a map opened slowly. She told him then, in a voice that trembled but did not break, about a time when a trusted acquaintance betrayed her. She said the word rape softly, as though naming it could make it larger than it needed to be, and she spoke of the child with fierce, humble love. Emmanuel listened and felt the floor of his assumptions shift. There was no cruelty in her confession, only a raw honesty that had been marshaled by fear. Fear of losing him, fear of being reduced to the wound she carried. She had not told him because she feared his kindness could be conditional, that the glitter of his life might slip away like coins through fingers when confronted with a past society judged more harshly than it forgave. Emmanuel's heart, which had been stunned by a market smile, now swelled with something deeper. A protective surge that was neither pity nor ownership, but the fierce, abiding desire to keep Grace's light safe. He reached for her hand as she spoke and felt the small, calloused warmth of someone who worked with her hands every day. In that touch he promised, not in words alone but in a steadied breath, to meet whatever came with openness. The child, watching them, shuffled a little and said something small to Grace, who replied with a laugh muffled by a sudden tear. Emmanuel realized then that love is not only the bright, instantaneous thing that can take your breath away. It is also the willingness to hold a person's darkness without flinching. When love tiptoes into the open, so too do eyes. The city is never quiet for long when a story smells of novelty. A billionaire seeing a tomato seller seemed to feed gossip in the same way bright fruit fed appetite. Photographs surfaced in the quieter corners of social feeds. A man in a tailored suit buying tomatoes, a woman smiling modestly, captions that tried to make sense of something their authors had not felt. Emmanuel ignored most of it. The attention was superficial noise compared to the solidity he felt in small moments with Grace. But some noise has weight, and the kind that matters often arrives in the shape of family. Emmanuel's mother, Madame Ifioma, had run their household with an authority born of old money and older expectations. She wore tradition like armor and hospitality like a banner. When Emmanuel introduced her to Grace at a tea arranged in the quieter room of a family house that smelled faintly of baked dough and polished wood, the conversation began as all civil meetings do, with polite questions about upbringing and intentions. Grace sat with a calm, composed chest, her hands folded, eyes respectful and kind. She answered each question honestly but succinctly. Emmanuel watched his mother's face for the first cracks of approval, but saw instead a crease form between her brows. Madame Ifioma had envisioned a certain kind of match for her son. Someone educated in the right schools, who could navigate drawing rooms and the subtle etiquette of their clans. A tomato seller, she thought, could be admirable in many ways, but in the world of alliances and reputations, she worried of fragility and judgment. Her skepticism was not born of malice but concern that her son's life, a life that had been carefully curated like a prized garden, might be trampled by forces the family could neither predict nor control. Rumors amplified the unease. Someone whispered that Grace had a child. Others distorted the truth into caricature. Madame Ifioma's initial disapproval hardened when she sensed omissions. Mothers, after all, are unforgivingly skilled at sensing what is not said. The knowledge that Grace had been through a traumatic event, something no family once connected to their name in gossip, smacked against the polished walls Madame Ifioma had built to protect her lineage. She worried, as mothers do, about inheritance. Not only of money, but of respectability, and about whether Emmanuel would be burdened by scandal. Emmanuel found himself caught between two loves. One was deep and uncomplicated, his affection for Grace, and the other was ancestral, braided into the fabric of his life. His duty to his family's expectations. He tried to speak to his mother with the language she respected. Facts, plans, reassurances. He told her about Grace's everyday kindnesses, about the way she loved the city and the people in it, about the child who played at her feet like a small comet. He painted scenes of domesticity. Grace making a simple stew, Emmanuel returning from a long day to find a small note on the kitchen table. He showed her that Grace's values, integrity, generosity, resilience, were the same values that had guided their own family for generations. But Madame Ifioma could not be persuaded by anecdotes alone. She raised practical objections. How could a union be proper without introductions to the right circles? How could she trust that the child, unacknowledged in earlier conversation, would not become a point of scandal when the press, ever hungry, learned how to parade pain for clicks? Emmanuel felt the weight of family history pressing against his chest. He was used to negotiating terms in boardrooms. Here, negotiation felt heartless. He could not draft a contract around a person's past. Grace, for her part, bore the stairs with a dignity that made Emmanuel ashamed of the small comforts money could not buy. She did not ask for pity or perform victimhood for sympathy. She worked, laughed, stayed kind. When she learned that Emmanuel's mother disapproved, she withdrew into herself at times, weighing love against the possibility of being rejected for something she could neither change nor had chosen. Emmanuel resisted the urge to protect her by hiding her away. Instead, he invited confrontation with tenderness. He asked his mother to come to the market again, to see the life Grace lived, to meet the child whose eyes crowded truth into the room. The market's bustle stripped away formalities. It showed life as it was lived. Raw, messy, luminous. Slowly, Madame Ifioma's armor softened as she watched Grace hand over a tomato to an elderly neighbor with a care that was unperformative. The old woman's grandchildren later hugged Grace as if she had always belonged. It was not an immediate conversion. Love rarely bends a matriarch's resolve overnight. But the market's ordinary compassion slowly embroidered a different narrative in Madame Ifioma's mind. Perhaps worth is not always measured by titles or addresses. Emmanuel stood between the two women, his mother and the woman he loved, and hoped that patience, witness, and the humility of exposure would be enough to tilt the balance. The city's seasons turned. Rains came, roads slickened with stories, and life pressed on with stubborn insistence. Emmanuel found that the deeper he fell, the heavier the secrets that surrounded Grace seemed to loom in the corners. He did not demand disclosures like an interrogator. He asked gently, and Grace offered what she could when she was ready. The truth about the child had already been told. It arrived wrapped in sorrow, but also in a fierce, maternal tenderness that made Emmanuel rethink the notion of bravery. Yet more became clear as they spent afternoons together away from the market's hum. Grace revealed the small details of survival. How she had worked extra hours washing clothes, how neighbors had covered for each other when times were tight, the ritual of her son's bedtime lullaby. She told Emmanuel carefully that she had feared telling him because fear had taught her that love sometimes fled at the first sign of a wound. Emmanuel listened and learned to be still in ways his empire had never required. One evening, on a veranda where the city's lights blinked like distant constellations, Grace admitted she had kept other things private too. There were legal battles she had avoided, memories that rose like bitter taste when provoked, and nights when she had contemplated surrendering to a shame that was never hers to own. She had been taught by circumstance to bridle her self-assurance. By emotion, she had learned to keep some things close. Emmanuel did not flinch. Instead, he showed up in practical ways. He found a lawyer who quietly addressed the paperwork required to ensure Grace and her child would be legally secure, without fanfare. He helped organize medical checkups when needed, not out of charity but out of shared responsibility. He insisted that anything done would be on Grace's terms. The dignity of choice mattered as much as the outcome. Word of Emmanuel's actions reached the market, sometimes before Grace herself knew the extent of his interventions. Some praised, others sneered. The richer the love story sounded, the louder the chorus of skeptics. But Grace, who had twice been asked to account for her body and her life, learned to accept help not as a surrender, but as a recognition of partnership. Emmanuel, too, learned that wealth can buy comfort but cannot take pain away. Only presence could do that. When his mother saw how Emmanuel moved to protect Grace's privacy, insisting the press leave certain matters untouched, the old woman began to understand that love had changed him in ways too large for gossip to catalog. She watched him spend evenings coaxing laughter from a small boy who had once known only the mood of hunger. She watched him sit in the market with no airs, his hands stained by tomato juice, and in that image something softened inside her breast. Power, she noted, was useless if not tempered by humanity. Grace's relationship with Emmanuel did not erase the darker parts of her past. Such wounds do not vanish because a hand is offered. But now, with Emmanuel's steady presence and her mother-in-law's gradual acceptance, Grace felt less alone in carrying the burden. She began to tell her story in small circles, to close friends and to community members who had known her quietly for years. Each telling lightened something. Each listening ear made her past less monstrous and more human. Because Emmanuel loved Grace openly and without pretense, the city slowly stopped reducing their relationship to spectacle. People began to recognize the reality. Two people who had chosen each other, despite asymmetries of wealth and despite complicated histories. Grace, who had once feared losing the man who had come into her life like a sunrise, saw that love was not conditional on perfection but on fidelity. Fidelity to truth, to kindness, and to showing up. And Emmanuel learned that love asks you to be brave in ways that money never can buy. It asks for vulnerability, for the willingness to be transformed. He had fallen at first sight under a market tarpaulin. What came next was the tested, deliberate choice to remain. That choice proved more binding and more beautiful than any contract he had ever signed. As the months folded into one another, Emmanuel and Grace built a rhythm of life that found its own music. They rose early sometimes to walk the quiet streets, shared jokes over simple breakfasts, and sat together in the evenings reading. She reading aloud from borrowed novels, him listening as if each sentence were a new contract to savor. Her son learned to trust the presence of a man who once might have seemed impossible, and Emmanuel learned how to braid small hands into larger plans. But harmony always invites tests. When Emmanuel proposed, genuinely gently on an afternoon when the market smelled of earth and fried plantain, the announcement spread. Some neighbors clapped as if at a wedding rehearsal, others whispered of mismatched classes. Madame Iphioma, who had softened but not fully surrendered her skepticism, felt the old concerns rise once more. Her son's social standing, the whispers of the city, the logistics of integrating lives that had been so different. A structural test arrived not from gossip but from a larger business dispute. One of Emmanuel's companies faced a public scandal engineered by rivals who wanted to unsettle his holdings. Headlines flared and fingers pointed. Opportunistic columnists searched Emmanuel's private life for stories that might distract from or exacerbate the crisis. The timing could not have been worse. The family held its breath. Grace, who lived her days in the honest economy of market trade, suddenly found herself in the eye of a storm that felt both foreign and cruel. Emmanuel watched fear ripple through the people he loved. He saw the strain in Grace's smile when she read about the controversy on a neighbor's phone. He saw his mother, stern and silent, calculate the risks and losses. The easy comforts that had shaped their new life felt threatened by forces neither had invited. In the face of such a storm, Grace's dignity was luminous. She did not perform grand gestures of public defense. Instead, she acted in the quiet ways that had always defined her. Calming Emmanuel's younger relatives who feared for their own futures, cooking a pot of stew for displaced stall owners after a market rainstorm, keeping the child's routine intact. Her steadiness became the anchor for others. Emmanuel realized that the love he had for her was not romanticized softness. It was practical, resilient, the kind that stayed when spotlight glare turned cold. Madame Ifeoma watched, and in that watching something shifted fully. She observed Grace without the filter of class or rumor. She saw a woman who could hold a household together with humor, who could speak gently to frightened neighbors, who kept faith with people without seeking credit. The matriarch understood that the strength required to withstand the markets and the city storms was not measured by degrees or addresses but by constancy and compassion. Her final objection, that a tomato seller could not carry the weight of their family, dissolved not in a dramatic confession but in the slow accumulation of witnessed acts. The company scandal cleared with time, legal finesse, and a decisive defense that Emmanuel engineered with the same integrity he had brought to his courtship. The newspapers moved on. In their wake, what remained were the people who had stood by him. Emmanuel and Grace emerged not unscathed, but more bonded than before. The public romance had been tested by harsh winds and had not broken. It had simply been tempered. On the day of their wedding, a small ceremony where a circle of market friends mingled with a circle of family, Madame Ifeoma would stand and give a slow, private smile that spoke more than any public statement. She slipped a coin into Grace's palm in the hush after vows, an old family custom. Grace's eyes shone not with triumph but with gratitude. Emmanuel and Grace had learned that love at first sight was only the beginning. The lasting part was the daily choice to care. Their marriage did not rewrite the city, but it changed certain lives in subtle ways. Grace continued to visit the market at times, more to taste the everyday life she cherished than from necessity. Emmanuel found that his businesses bore traces of her influence. Employee programs were expanded to assist market vendors, a small fund created to help parents with childcare in the community where Grace had grown up. He used resources not to buy forgiveness or fame, but to create bridges where once there had been only walls. They built a home that smelled of stew and machine oil, books, and the faint sweetness of fresh tomatoes. Grace taught Emmanuel to appreciate the poetry of ordinary work, how hands can be both gentle and strong, how a child's laugh can be the loudest blessing. Emmanuel taught Grace to read contracts with clarity and to sit confidently at tables where men once assumed having the final word. They taught each other to be better people, not by coercion but by example. Madame Ifeoma became a regular at markets that once were indignities to her. She learned the names of vendors and would sometimes barter in a way that made children giggle. Her acceptance did not erase the hard lessons she had been taught, but it did soften them into compassion. She privately apologized once to Grace for initial coldness. Grace accepted with a generosity that surprised and healed. When the child celebrated a school win, Madame Ifeoma clapped the loudest. Love, once started with a single gaze under a market tarp, had become a steady current that carried more than two people. It carried communities, repaired old prejudices, and modeled a different kind of leadership. Emmanuel's colleagues noticed that decisions now considered the human margin more. Grace's neighbors noticed that their world had a little more room. And on a warm evening, gathered with friends from markets and boardrooms, Emmanuel and Grace recorded a short message for those who had followed their story. How love had been both miracle and work, how forgiveness and truth had been necessary, how bravery was often the softest thing of all, the day-to-day showing up. Grace stood beside Emmanuel, the child between them, and smiled at the small audience that had become a family. Then Emmanuel looked directly into the camera, took Grace's hand, and the family waved. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, kindly give a thumbs up, tell us what you think about the story, and where you're watching from in the comment section. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss a new upload. Share this story with someone you know would love it as well. Stay safe, stay blessed. I'll see you in the next. Stay turned. Bye for now. Life lesson. True love listens before it judges, stays when it's hard, and heals by choosing patience, courage, and consistent kindness over spectacle.